Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our latest in our series of 2023 webcasts. Today, we're talking about delivering on environmental social governance, ESG, and aligning all of the elements of what is a complex, nuanced topic. And you can see some of the elements below. So thank you all for joining us. My name is Dan French. I'm the one on the left, and thank you all for joining. I know many of you, so thank you for joining us again. I'm very pleased to be joined by Martin Reeves, who's a managing consultant in our risk management practice, but also deeply involved in the ESG agenda. So welcome, Martin.
Hi, everyone.
And we'll be talking to you this afternoon about this topic. So here's the agenda. We've got 30 minutes with you. We're going to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ESG context. It is a little bit broader and more nuanced than some of the topics we discuss. There's a very relevant, interesting question about why does ESG affect financial control and compliance executives? Well, it doesn't seem to be directly about financial control. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the myths of ESG, strategies for success, and thoughts for the road. So Martin's going to share some of his experiences and observations, and we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So please ask questions as you go through. There's a Q&A panel in your GoToWebinar interface. So pop in questions as they come to mind. It makes it more, it gets it off your chest, and it makes it more interactive when we get to those questions. If you have any technical issues with the webcast service itself, pop a question in there also, and we will one of our team will endeavor to help you out. So let's start with what is kind of one of the first big questions. I mean, acronyms are always dangerous in business, and ESG is probably more dangerous than many. This environmental social governance span of control, if you like, is very, very broad and very nuanced, and you can be forgiven for thinking that ESG is just about emissions. But it's about all of these things, and clearly that is a scary, daunting prospect. So one thing to bear in mind is, you're unlikely to be dealing with all of that in one go, but it is, the kind of full scope of the domain as we move forward. So one thing that's absolutely central in all of this is to work out within your own organization what good looks like from an ESG perspective. What are we actually aiming at? Obviously, some regulatory requirements coming through, but there are broader aspirations for every business, and there's broader demands which will become pressures on the organization over months and years to come as well. So we've got to work out what does good look like and what the priorities are. Now, what does good look like is one of the hardest questions in any business. And it seems like a simple question, but it's very, very hard. And you've got lots of different stakeholders who've got a slightly different view on it. And one of the challenges of coming up with the answer to what does good look like is trying to align all those views and get something that's a common accepted understanding for everyone to say, yes, that does explain where it is we're going. So that, I think, is one of the biggest lessons that I've taken out of all of these discussions we've had over at ESG. And if you look at the broad definition, it's a shock to the system. And then you have to look at what are we really focusing on for the next few months and year or so, and that indeed will expand over time. And the other thing is, no surprise, and particularly when you've got an acronym involved, as soon as a new theme becomes popular, every technology vendor decides to rebrand their technology. So all the governance, risk management, compliance tool vendors are busy rebranding their tools to be ESG risk management tools, which is fine up to a point, but just bear in mind these wonderful two rules of automation. And the first is that automation applied to an efficient operational process will magnify the efficiency of that process. And the second is automation applied to an inefficient operation or poorly defined process will magnify the inefficiency. So that, I think, describes the very risk pretty appropriately. So bear that in mind. Now we talk about process, and here's another kind of nuanced question which we perhaps never expected to be nuanced, in that when you ask, if you were to ask 10 colleagues to write down, how do you define business process? The surprising thing is you get 10 or maybe even 11 different answers. And that is a bit of a challenge when you're trying to harmonize activities. So Obviously, the examples at the top, I'm not going to read all this, but when you read through this yourself, you can start to realize that a business process is about something that's producing an outcome, it has direct or indirect value to the organization and to your customers and your people, and it's about the experience of how that activity takes place, as well as all of the elements of producing the outcome, including habits and behaviors, as well as the technologies and systems and core activities. So that's kind of quite a that's quite a nuanced thing. And as you will hear from Martin, understanding what you mean by process is really important, not just in ESG, but in every end-to-end cycle. And so that's worthy of some thought. But that's my kind of introduction, if you like. And I would just say that, when you've got complex questions, as we see often in business and possibly even in life, we do clutch at what might be the simple answers. And sadly, often the simple answers to complex questions are just wrong, or certainly have a lot of unintended consequences. And but really, the complex, nuanced questions have complex, nuanced answers, which is this road less traveled or path less traveled on the right-hand side. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce Martin, who has been walking the path less traveled for some time. So Martin, welcome. Tell us about this path, and perhaps more importantly, why is ESG on the agenda for financial control and compliance executives?
Well, thanks, Dan. And yeah, it's an interesting question. So ESG, it's the way we see it, or the way we know it today, it sort of took shape in the mid-2000s, although a lot of the principles have been around for decades. And there've also been plenty of campaigns pressurizing companies into fairer, more sustainable business practices. But today, ESG is, with the attention from investors, from regulators, then it's focused around investment and reporting. And because of this increased regulatory focus from be it the UK or the EU or the SEC in the US around climate-related disclosures, they've sort of been tied to financial reporting. So financial departments now face new challenges that I suppose go beyond internal controls over financial reporting and SOX. And also, to make it a bit more complicated, we've got this plethora of global standards for materiality and reporting. So why is ESG important? And we understand, as I just said, from an investment and a regulation compliance perspective, there is certainly an importance there. But we've got employees who more and more want to work at companies with a strong sense of purpose, so that they're more inspired, motivated and loyal. We've got consumers that are motivated to purchase from companies committed to making the world a better place. And by getting on top of your ESG strategy, you've got an advantage in getting prepared for the future. But one thing that I'm seeing more and more is coming on the agenda is ESG driving operational efficiency. So the idea that by implementing an ESG program, we have the potential to improve performance, eliminate waste, as an example. From a stakeholder perspective, identifying stakeholders, it's never a trivial or easy thing. And it's not about the people who are paying for the initiative, but we know about the shareholders, the auditors, the regulators. We've also got suppliers and customers, insurers, rating agencies. But if we think of ESG, we want to embed this in the organization. Even from a reporting perspective, we need to do it. But if we're looking at its potential to increase operational efficiency, then one of the most important stakeholders become our employees. So I want to look at a couple of the myths around ESG. The first one is ESG is purely altruism. So if altruism is the selfless concern for the well-being of others, then I think this view of ESG, it's a bit short-sighted. We're not all here, no business is out there to save the planet. Collectively, we probably might do it, but It should be about business operations. I mean, there's an opportunity here, as I've said, to develop your ESG program beyond regulatory reporting. It can become a driver for operational efficiency, elimination of waste. So things like just-in-time manufacturing, reduction of packaging, warehousing space, just a few examples. There's a huge potential to increase or improve performance. And the second myth, that technology is key to ESG success. So we know that any end-to-end cycle that is reliant or based upon a process, enabling that process, we need technology. But you know, there's often a temptation, and I see it out there in businesses where technology is putting the cart before the horse. Technology is leading, and then we're sort of trying to fix processes. And remember, we see so many, you know, all these technologies work wonders in PowerPoint, and at the moment we're seeing a lot of vendors who are rebranding existing technology to make it, or to call it, ESG enabled. But I think the important thing here is to due diligence and proofing technology that should be key to the implementation. And you know, if our focus is around compliance and regulatory reporting, if we're going to move that to include operational efficiency, then the technology we need might be different than just for regulatory reporting. So let's have a look at the strategies for success. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? Is it just about compliance and our reporting obligation, or do we want to leverage ESG to drive operational efficiency? I mean, whichever way we want to go, one of the most important things is that we think about continuous improvement, be it better reporting for ESG or continuous improvement for driving operational efficiency as a core to success. So from a reputation perspective, do we want to be seen as, you know, very good as being ESG compliant, or do we want to be seen as you know, best in class with regards to sustainability, operational efficiency, etc.
That's a great point, because that businesses are more and more under pressure and under measurement from independent bodies about how ethical they are, how environmentally friendly they are. So it does affect the core of business. This isn't just a sideline activity.
Absolutely, yeah. So here are some of the challenges. I mean, the first one is probably the most important. If we can't identify our stakeholders, then the rest becomes relevant. But just a couple of snippets here. Finding leading indicators, so our KPIs, leading indicators on ESG progress are very important. I'm going to come back to this, but leading indicators are the ones that tell us about things that are broken, where are our defects, which allow us then to focus on continuous improvement. We also need to be agile, because even if we just focus on the regulatory reporting aspect, the landscape is changing very rapidly, with new requirements also coming in on the horizon. So where do we start in understanding our end-to-end cycle? Start with the why. What's the raison d'etre? What problem are we trying to solve? Is it compliance? Is it about operational efficiency? What does good look like? What are the barriers to success? And we know it's, you know, it's around this people. You've all seen this paradigm: people, process, data, technology. I mean, the really important piece here is that we do focus on the process as the foundation of this paradigm. And if we think about the end-to-end cycle for ESG, it sort of falls into this end-to-end cycle of risk to perform. So whether we're looking at ESG or whether we're looking at enterprise risk management, we've got these phases, if you will, where we've got to identify and assess risk. We then mitigate with policies and controls. We monitor the current state. We act with resolutions and attestations. We confirm that the risk management approach remains valid, that it gives us the desired level of assurances that we've defined, and then we manage and sustain continuous improvement. We set revised targets, and we refine the operating model. So for ESG, we use this approach called journey mapping. What we see here is a set of steps for an end-to-end cycle. So what we've just seen on the risks to perform in the previous slide, this is in a bit more detail, from identify to assess right through to manage. And you can see we've got these different aspects for each part of these end-to-end cycle. What are the objectives, the work activities, touch points, accountability, policies, controls, what's our reporting, documentation, technology, what's the experience of it. And this is a way that we can capture the information about the process in the current state, where we can look at what works well, where there's pain points and challenges, where there's gaps in the fulfillment of objectives. And it's a good way to discuss end-to-end cycles, to manage complexity, to come up with a common vocabulary, a common understanding across stakeholder groups. And they're easy to focus and share and develop. And what you see here is what we call the journeys. So the idea that how we report on carbon emissions, for example, going across this risk to perform process is going to be a completely different journey with different stakeholders, maybe different technologies, different policies, than if we're talking about community relations or labour standards.
And that's actually particularly relevant, or even more relevant with ESG than is in any other end-to-end process, because we're in a stage where things are moving very fast. So there'll be a lot of change. You might well start with just a couple of journeys in ESG, but very quickly over the months and coming years, you're going to have a lot more. So this gives you a kind of framework for flexibility.
Absolutely. So we mentioned KPIs, lagging and leading indicators. So lagging indicators, what are they? They are they're after the event. They tell us how well we're doing. They're sort of a performance measure. These are the indicators that we need for the regulatory reporting. They tell us how good we're doing. But if we want to focus on continuous improvement, improving operational efficiency, then we need the leading indicators. These are focused around defects. They show us what's not working well, so that we can identify the areas where we need to increase efficiency or performance. We talked about stakeholders. I said it's difficult enough identifying the right stakeholders, but how do we get buy-in from stakeholders across the business for this end-to-end cycle? How do we get alignment between them? And I think it takes a lot of skill and effort to build and maintain what I would call this coalition of stakeholders. It takes effort and work to get them on board, to get them aligned. And we need to be asking them questions. We need to be asking them the right questions. And one of them certainly is this, what we call this WIFM, this what's in it for me. We need to be able to ask the right questions, and we need to be able to listen to what they're telling us. And this isn't easy. It requires us to reinforce our emotional intelligence, because these questions, they're often thought-provoking. They require a level of trust for someone to give you an honest answer. I mean, have we earned the right to ask the questions that we need answered? It's easy to talk about trust, but it's got to be earned, and it's often very difficult to quantify. So let's have a look at how we go about putting our ESG program in place. The first thing I want to look at is identifying the risks, and very important here. So the risk assessment that we need to do, the materiality assessments that we need to do, we've got to engage our stakeholders in these assessments, be they the internal and external stakeholders. They've got to be fully engaged. in this process. We've talked about the metrics, making sure that we've got the leading and the lagging performance indicators, lagging for the reporting, as I've said, and leading for the drivers for continuous improvement. We need to assess, so using our approach and our journey mapping, we can assess current state from a people, programs, process, policy perspective. Now, from an ESG perspective, we're probably going to be very light on assessing as is. I mean, there are going to be some programs in place. There are probably going to be silos of current activity. These need to be assessed. We need to gauge the maturity across the business. But we can look at these silos of ESG activity. We take with us what works well. We capture the pain points, things that we need to improve. And once we've assessed current state, then we need to go into defining our goals, our direction, our to-be process. Again, as I said, this should be based on what works well. So we want to maintain what is good, and then challenges and pain points that we've discovered, we want to improve and optimize on them. We want to set SMART objectives, SMART being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, relevant, and time-bound. From a data perspective, we need to identify the sources of data. Are they the right scope? Where do they reside? Who owns the data? And when we collect it and validate it and harmonize it, who's involved? What's the retrieval cadence? Is it accurate and verifiable? Is it auditable? And from a reporting perspective, are the insights meaningful or are they actionable? And then we've got to implement. And implementation, so we've defined the goals and objectives in the previous phase, but now we've got to go and implement. And as we implement, the main thing we need to do is manage change. And remember, it's not just about change to process and change to organization, but it's about change to behavior as well. How do we succeed in getting people to operate in the new way? And because, you know, we've said that one of the main stakeholders in the success of ESG is our employees, you know, we've got to be able to win hearts and minds of our employees to making this process change as successful. And of course, once we've put it in place, it's moving targets. We'll probably identify opportunities for improvement. We're going to have new requirements coming in from the regulation as external demands change. And so ESG as an end-to-end cycle, whether we're just looking at regulation reporting or we want to leverage the potential for operational efficiency, in order to be successful, we've got to embed ESG in our business processes. And
I think that's a really important point, Martin, because you know we sometimes think about the regulatory demand as we've got to report on emissions, let's say, but that's only problem number one. We can't keep reporting on emissions and continue to say the same or get worse. So the point here is every business process, every cycle we operate in our business is a driver for ESG. So if we want our ESG performance to get better, then we have to do different things in our processes, which is why, as Martin says, we've got to have this awareness and connectivity to ESG drivers in every process in the business.
And we all know about silos. We know that silo efficiencies are not good for the end-to-end cycle. And I think because we want to embed ESG into our end-to-end business, then it also has a huge potential to break the barriers of silos as we implement it across the business.
Thank you, Martin. There's some definitely thought-provoking stuff there about stakeholders and processes, and the fact that it keeps coming back to me. We talk about reporting, ESG reporting, That's only part of the problem. We've got to be getting better. That continuous improvement piece is key. Now, do remember to ask your questions through the interface. We will be answering those at the end, and those we don't have time to answer, we'll be doing by email, but please pop them in the interface. So I'm just going to look at some of the points that Martin's made and sort of come around to some thoughts here. I mean, I really like this, this idea of really starting with the why. What does good look like? Yes, we know technology is important, but this idea of understanding the end-to-end process and defining those journeys, that seems to me to be a pretty central tenet of success. And these myths, I think it's absolutely right in the money. A lot of people say, oh, ESG, is it that environmental stuff? Can we just put it in a tower, you know, a function at the side of our business? No, it's central. It's central to our business because we're, you know, if we're not going to get any better if we don't change the way we operate, and that's every one of our processes. And this piece about technology, Martin described that really well. We don't, you know, we can't rely on technology as the first step of transformation. We've got to understand what good looks like in the process first. So I think there's 5 key recommendations that come out from what Martin suggested. And, you know, this key point, identify and engage your stakeholders in this ESG end-to-end process and journeys. Not just the stakeholder that is the first one to put their hand up because they're the ESG executive on the executive committee, but who are the other stakeholders? You've got to find them and you've got to engage them. Doing a 360-degree assessment of your as-is process and journeys, as Martin says, they might be a bit lean at the moment, but you've got to know what you got. Partly because you're going to have to transition from something to new ways of working, and secondly, you just want, there might be some good stuff there you can use. We've got to develop those to be journeys. That's critical. And we've talked a little bit about separating out those journeys so we've got flexibility for new demands in the future, both demands from our business as our aspirations develop, and demands from regulators because they're going to change on a regular basis. And this point that Martin hit home pretty heavily is we've got to use ESG as a driver to help stimulate continuous improvement in every one of our business processes. If you just think about the emissions piece, you know, emissions are a byproduct of activity, of energy usage, whether it's in people's work, in offices, in technology, compute power, whatever, transportation. Every time we eliminate waste, every time we drive better cycles, shorten the cycle time, we're impacting our ESG outputs. And then use these drivers as a performance improvements target for all processes and all process owners, so it doesn't become just an ivory tower issue for the ESG people. So that's pretty key. But of course, there are no quick fixes, no easy hacks. And I like this. I like this quote. The guy's a Nobel Prize winner, and he was a surgeon, but it's perfectly relevant in the world we're talking about. So I'd recommend we all consider that. So that's what we've talked about. We're going to pick up a couple of your questions now. Thank you very much for your attention. So we've just got a couple of minutes left to go. So what have we got? We've got a few questions here. So what have we got? So you talked about ESG regulations, stakeholders, objectives, processes. Where should we start? So I do accept. I think we've taken this nuanced topic and made it, explain how big it is. But I think it's fair to, despite everything we've said, I think much of the initial drive will likely be from regulatory demands. That's fine. But your organization will also have some internal objectives and aspirations, either articulated as part of your brand or as part of internal company expectations. So make sure that you connect all the stakeholders around not just what you're doing right now, but where it's going. And it relates to our business as well as to regulation. I think that's a key thing. Martin, would you add anything to that?
I think the key thing is to recognize that, meeting our ESG obligations and expectations, it's an outcome of, it's doing the things right and it's doing the right thing. So, I think we should educate our stakeholders that process improvements like, elimination of waste, operational efficiency, etc. It's part of delivering ESG outcomes. And of course, we've got the 5-phase program that we can use as well.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Here's another one which I think some of you might recognize. Regulation is a prime driver for ESG in our company. Given that, do we need to worry about change management and what's in it for me? That's kind of a really interesting question. I think for many of you, regulation will be the prime driver, the kind of the compelling event that's forcing your activity right now. But in general, if you want to change behaviors, it's all about habits. And generally, habit change requires some what's in it for me for everybody whose habit is going to change. We all know that ourselves, whether it's getting fit, losing weight, whatever. But if you think about, if you've got a habit of driving too fast, even though you know it's against the law, you tend to keep doing it until you have a what's in it for me moment, which might be losing your license, getting a fine, or worse. So even when it's externally applied, what's in it for me is still absolutely critical. So thank you. We've got a bunch of other questions, but I did say we'd take 30 minutes of your time, and 30 minutes is up. So I thank you very much. If you've got questions now, you didn't pop in, just pop me an email. We'll get back to you. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and see you next time. And thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.